I shimmed out the power steering pump to get everything aligned right. I measured the length for a belt and found it to be exactly the same as the belt I did have, so that belt is a little on the short side, but it is long enough to get it installed and run it for now. So to protect the radiator hose from any collision with the alternator belt, I made this little hose clamp attachment. I just welded this little piece of sheet steel to the lower radiator hose clamp, and it ain't pretty, but that steel should definitely protect the hose from being rubbed through. And now let's finally try to get the alternator back on here. When making this bracket, I figured out a loose shim strategy here. Since we moved the crank pulley, things might have to change anyway. I'll tighten these bracket bolts down to 30 foot-pounds. Using the bolt this came with, you'd have to take the water pump pulley off. And we install the water pump pulley. Let's try to get that belt on. Very close, it's actually touching the radiator fan guard there. Now I just have to get the pulley alignment right. Okay, I'm gonna be here a little while. To line the pulleys up, it was mostly trial and error using washers as shims, and when the washers were too thick, I cut my own shims from some sheet steel to get the alignment as close as possible. And after all that shimming, I'm fairly confident in the pulley alignment. So now I'm going to install the outlet fitting on the fuel pump. Okay, that angle looks pretty good to me, and it's definitely tight. So this is the Edelbrock 1411 750 CFM carburetor that came on this engine and had been running it the whole time I was driving it. I'd rebuilt it in the past, so it doesn't need anything like that. All we're going to do is install this high flow needle and seat set and make sure everything in there is adjusted properly. The high flow needle and seat do exactly what they sound like. They have a slightly larger orifice so that a higher volume of fuel can flow through them to prevent the bowls from being emptied in a high load situation. After that, we set the floats back to stock specs, put in 1/16 secondary jets but kept the 110 primary jets, and then put the carburetor back together. So we're finally ready to bolt the carburetor back onto the engine. Then we can attach the throttle cable bracket. Then we install the hold down nuts with just a little bit of engine oil on them. And then I'll tighten down the hold down nuts to 12 foot-pounds. Okay, that's the carburetor most of the way installed. Next, I'm going to get started setting up the wiring for the radiator fans. So on the control side of the fan relay, the thermostatic switch will provide the ground, and the alternator field wire will supply the positive. That means the fans will only run while the engine is running. I've already tapped the alternator's field wire before to run the electric chokes relay, so I'm just going to piggyback that connection and run the wire along the fender and up to near the battery where the relay and fuse will be for the fans. I drew up a little wiring diagram to try to make this easier to understand and so that I can remember how everything is set up in the future. So next up, you gotta sort out the radiator. I sized things up and was pretty careful about locating everything because I knew I needed the two radiator fans on the back side of the radiator and the transmission cooler on the front, and I had to make sure the mountings didn't interfere with each other. I eventually found a spot for everything that worked, and I staggered the fans vertically so that every row of the radiator will have air from the fans flowing over it. And then once everything was mounted to the radiator, I dropped it into the car and bungee corded it in while I worked out where I wanted the mounts to be. I made really simple top mounts, just with some bent pieces of steel and rubber insulation, but they hold the radiator in place solidly. Since I took my time figuring out exactly where the transmission cooler should be on the front of the radiator, it was easy to connect the oil cooler hoses. I only had to bend one of the steel lines a little bit to get it around the front of the radiator. But now at least there is a real transmission oil cooler and it's installed properly. The lower radiator hose is all attached, The radiator fans are all wired up, but it is a little bit of a mess up here. I didn't want to drill any holes to mount the relay, so at the moment it's just zip tied to this brace. So the wires are just kind of hanging over top of the battery, which isn't great. I might just try to shove it inside the fender there in the future, but this will work for now. The fuel hoses are all hooked up. It comes out of that fitting into the fuel filter and up along the alternator and in to the carburetor. The wire for the electric choke, of course, ended up being too short, so I just added a little extension to it. The PCV hose is connected to the center port on the carburetor, and I installed a barb fitting in the rear of the carburetor for the power brakes. With the shorter scoop base, the stud was a little too long, so I cut it a little shorter, and then we can reinstall it and have an air cleaner back on top of the carburetor. The old throttle spring bracket mounted to the intake manifold, so of course it wasn't going to fit. So I made this very simple one that bolts to the carburetor stud and should do the job just fine. I already set up the spring so it has a good pedal feel and isn't too stiff or too loose. The transmission kickdown cable is currently just hanging here on the side of the intake manifold out of the way. I will install a longer cable to be able to use kickdown in the future. With the radiator installed, pretty much all that's left is to fill this thing with coolant. I'll pour in as much as I can through the thermostat housing, then install the upper radiator hose and fill it through the radiator. And thread them all in. And drop them. Thank you, Carl.